Okay, hey everybody. So this is finishing up the New Deal lecture. So our next alphabet soup organization that we have is the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Now, if we remember back to the end of the New Deal lecture, right, we had all of these young kids running away from home and riding the rails and riding the trains. And so the CCC is sort of created as a means to find something to do with those kids and to put them to work and to have them do something productive. Um, so what these runaways, what these young adults are doing is working. It's like a quasi-military style camp, but they're going up and working in nature. So improving national forests, helping maintain railroad lines, building campgrounds and bridges and dams and all this stuff. And the goal was to improve morale, improve physical fitness, and give kids an appreciation and accessibility to the outdoors. And we actually see some modern day programs like this as well, which is really interesting. But this got all of these young kids off of just riding the trains, and instead not only teaches them tangible skills that they'll be able to use later on and use to find some sort of profession and work later, but it's also improving the environment and teaching them basic accountability skills and things like that too. They would also get paid for doing all of this. So they would get paid $30 a month, which was considered a lot of money for the time. The average, like if you were on a state-sponsored welfare, the average family would get $2.39 per week per family. So about $10 a month for an entire family. And these kids were getting paid $30 for the entire month, which is a lot of money. But one of the things that they were required to do was either send home $22 every month, so they would only get to live off of 8, but send home $22 to their family or put that $22 into savings. So when they were done with the program, they could go and use that to buy a house or buy a car, invest it back into the economy somehow. Or they'd be using it to support their family, right? And give their family, help them eat and pay their mortgage and things like that. Over 3 million boys will go through the program in total. About 300,000 would be working at a single time. And this sticks around until World War II. It was never made permanent, but in World War II we get rid of it because we decided we want all these young men to go fight overseas rather than be doing the civilian corps. But we still see some programs like this that exist. So this is a cool way to sort of help the youth get back to work and teach them skills. Next up, we have the PWA, the Public Works Administration. So what the Public Works Administration's aim was to create employment, right? To put America back to work. People need to make money. The government doesn't want to just give out handouts. And so the solution is to create jobs. And how do we create jobs? Well, at this point in time, we're building stuff, right? We're creating building projects. Let's build a bridge. Let's build a road. Let's build an airport. And we will pay for the project. The government is paying for the project, but we'll pay civilians to do all of this. And so they're earning money, they're working hard, and we're building up the basic infrastructure of America while we do this. So there's sort of this positive there as well. The Bay Bridge will be a PWA project. The Lake Shasta Dam is a PWA project. So they've built some really long-lasting stuff. And they're also putting people back to work. And so this is a really cool aspect of the New Deals. It's not just like, oh, you guys need money for food or whatever. It's actually saying, you need money, work for it. Here's a job, right? And we're doing something productive for society as well. So it's job creation done by the federal government. Now, of course, that is really expensive, right? Building a bridge is not cheap. And so the government is paying for all of this, which is a lot of money. And that's going to be one of the criticisms. Also, one of the reasons why we can't just go around doing this all the time. But it was a good way to get people back to work. So the difference between the PWA and the next one, which is the WPA, is the PWA is more skilled workers and larger building projects, right? Highways, bridges, airports. So these are large-scale construction and industry jobs. The WPA does a similar thing of job creation, but on a smaller scale, right? So the WPA is creating, and this is the Works Progress Administration. They're trying to get the unemployed working as well, but they're building schools and they're building hospitals and post office and playgrounds, and they're doing sort of lower or smaller scale projects, still a big deal, but like not a bridge or a dam or something like that. And so they will employ tons of people as well. The WPA workers were also largely unskilled, and so this program didn't run quite as efficiently as the PWA because a lot of the people didn't really know what they were doing. So they would have to be thoroughly trained to do this skilled labor before they could actually do it. So it wasn't a super, uh, you know, efficient program, but it still put people back to work. So that was great. There's also work for other types of professionals, so like teachers and dentists. The WPA would try to find employment for them as well, doing something in some sort of area that they were good at. And then they also had a really interesting aspect too, which put artists back to work. So they had a program attempted to get artists, musicians, writers, actors working as well, doing something in their profession and in their field. And so we end up seeing the government commission like a bunch of murals on the sides of buildings and stuff, and they commission historians to go out and record oral narratives of people. So we actually get a lot of really interesting slave narratives from this time. So before the last generation of slaves died off, a lot of work was done to record slave stories during the Great Depression and because of the WPA, similar with Civil War veterans and things like that. So we have a lot of oral histories taken down in this era. Then photography, right, like that very famous picture of the migrant mother. So there's people photographing this whole process. And so it's finding work for people in whatever capacity they can, which is pretty cool. All of this, right, the overarching goal is to eliminate unemployment and therefore stimulate the economy. So if people are back to work, they're going to have money. And if they have money, they can buy stuff. And then again, like we've talked about with our spiral so many times, this is just reversing it. It's going up again, right? If people can buy stuff, then companies are paying people to make stuff. And if people are making stuff, then they have jobs. And if they have jobs, they have money and blah, blah, blah. So that's the hope. And it does provide a good amount of relief. We actually have a lot of work that was done here in Santa Cruz. So the WPA paid for work on Center Street, Church Street, Empire Grade, many of the roads and natural bridges. All of the additions to Santa Cruz City Hall were WPA projects. The Santa Cruz Civic Auditorium were WPA projects. And also the murals on the Santa Cruz Post Office on Front Street were also WPA projects. So that's kind of cool. And finally, a lot of the way that this worked too is they would also just like fund like local municipalities. So like if Santa Cruz really needed one of its roads fixed, they're like, well, Center Street needs to be fixed. They would apply to the WPA for the funds to do that, and that way they could organize it locally. So that kind of helped spread some of the effort away from the WPA. Okay, next acronym of our alphabet soup is the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. So the goal of the TVA was to provide electricity and water to the very impoverished interior in the southern areas. So it starts largely in Tennessee, obviously. And they're trying to create dams and bring electricity and running water to areas that didn't have it yet because they were so rural and so poor. Where the TVA runs into problems is the government owned the utility program that would be providing the water and providing electricity and stuff. And so because there was no sort of competition or there's no other businesses owning it and it was all government owned and therefore the government was making the profit, it was seen as unconstitutional and too much like socialism. We don't have average Americans making a profit off of this, so it ends up getting shut down pretty quick. Next, we have the NRA, and this is not the National Rifle Association. This is the National Recovery Act. And the National Recovery Act will also ultimately be declared unconstitutional, along with some of the other New Deal projects. But this really shows sort of the tension between the older guard Supreme Court and what they view as okay or not, and the very sort of new active New Dealers and new government people. So the goal of the NRA, the National Recovery Act, was to ensure orderly and fair competition in business. And the act authorized the president to set up the National Recovery Administration to draft a set of codes for more than 500 different industries. And these codes were supposed to set wages and prices and child labor and attempt sort of overall to ensure fair competition in business. The act suspended antitrust regulations, and representatives from the industries sort of joined together to write all of these codes as a whole. But it ultimately, the criticism will be this is not allowing for competition. You need to let businesses in the market, do things themselves. You cannot set prices. You can't set wages. And this will be declared unconstitutional in 1935. So pretty quickly. And yeah, it's going to get a lot of criticism pretty early on because it was seen as, again, too much, right? Not enough. And so eventually this will be abandoned as well. Next, we have Social Security. And so the core of the Social Security Act was to protect all citizens against economic risks of unemployment and old age. It also provided a basic safety net for single mothers. But society doesn't really support single mothers because they don't necessarily approve of them, right? So that's oftentimes what we've seen is women are, stigmatized or, as we've also seen, sterilized for getting pregnant outside of wedlock. And so we haven't seen a lot of support in the past for this. And that's really going to try to change here with Social Security. So while Social Security makes huge changes, it still doesn't cover large sections of society. So domestic servants and agriculturalists are not covered by Social Security, right? So if you're working as a housekeeper or working in someone's house, or if you're working in the fields as an agricultural worker, you're not covered. It's not seen as like a real job. And these are also the jobs that predominantly are occupied by women or people of color, right? And so we're excluding this huge section of the population because of this. So they're not working, they're not getting to take advantage of this. The goal of Social Security, again, is to help prevent against what happened in the Great Depression. So it's providing that basic safety net. It's saying, once you get too old to work, we'll have a system to try to help take care of you. If you get hurt on the job, we'll have a system to try to help take care of you. And if you get fired, we'll have a system to help get you back on your feet and working again until you can get to that point. So you don't have to lose your house and have your family out on the street and whatnot. So that's really important. It's just trying to put down the basic safety net that we did not have during the Great Depression. And we need that. That's really important. So if something like the Great Depression happens again, we do have a system that we can rely on to alleviate the most basic needs. Now, again, this system does not pay out a lot of money. We have a lot of myths surrounding like the welfare queen or the idea of working the system and completely just living off of that and not doing any work. And that's really hard to do given the amount that they give you. That is a problem, right? We don't want to expand Social Security too much because that has happened in many states. Ireland was having a massive crisis with this a few years ago. Is their Social Security system was so large and so big that the government almost went bankrupt trying to support all these people who weren't actually working. And you could hang out in like a beautiful 3-bedroom house without a job by just getting your paycheck. So if it gets too big, it does start to bankrupt the government, but we do need it there too in order to prevent, something like what we saw happen before. So it's all a balance, just like most things are. The southern states refused to pass through the Social Security Act without the exclusion of domestic workers and agricultural workers. Again, this really affects women and people of color. 85% of women of color were working as domestics or agriculturalists at the time. So this disproportionately affects this portion of the population. This is what we call institutionalized racism and institutionalized sexism, right? A law that's designed to not, purposefully designed to not treat everyone equally, right? Or not give certain portions of the population an equal shot at it. The other very controversial aspect of Social Security, like we kind of talked about, is welfare. And welfare is supposed to support women who do not have husbands and help them care for their children. Women were traditionally stigmatized, right, and sort of excluded from all of this because you weren't supposed to have children outside of wedlock. And there's a lot of rules and regulations. So if you are on welfare, you are very closely monitored to make sure that you are actually using the money for what you say that you're using it. And there's all these weird rules surrounding it. So you can't have a boyfriend, for example, because they assume that the boyfriend would help you pay for stuff. You can't have another job, even though welfare isn't enough to live on, which also seems kind of counterintuitive because it's like you want women to be, trying to get back on their feet, but you're only supposed to have, just live off of the welfare. And today, you're really not getting paid that much. It would be incredibly hard to live solely off of welfare, and you're living in extreme poverty if you are. There is welfare fraud, just like there's fraud within every government agency, and it's all at about the same rates. So we don't really have this, it's not disproportionate. Welfare is not disproportionately frauded in comparison to other agencies. But this will provide sort of our first basic security system, right? Our basic safety net. So that's good. And Social Security sticks around until today, although obviously it's controversial. Next up, we have the Wagner Act. So the Wagner Act is also known as the National Labor Relations Act, but more commonly known as the Wagner Act. So if we remember back, one of sort of the hypocrisies or paradoxes of the 1920s is the restriction of all these progressive forms, right? We had this big progressive era, and then even though the 20s are progressive in terms of like social change and all this stuff, we do see the government trying to overturn a lot of gains that we had seen from the progressive movement. And a lot of that will be reversed, right? Child labor laws, minimum wage, things like that. And so the Wagner Act actually brings back many of the gains that were made in World War I and in the progressive era. But there's still some limitations to it. So some of the things that are put in place are minimum wage, overtime pay. So if you work more than 40 hours a week, then you get overtime pay. It establishes that as the baseline, right? 8-hour work days, 40 hours a week as basic. It prevents against child labor, and it creates the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, which is an outside government agency that settles unfair labor practices and sort of monitors what's going on with the labor board as a whole. Still, though, the Wagner Act also does not cover domestic workers or agriculturalists, who again are disproportionately people of color or women. And so we're not going to see a lot of changes in that until like Cesar Chavez does the unionizing of migrant workers in the 1970s in California. That's why that was so necessary. And this role that a lot of immigrants fill now is not covered by a lot of this stuff. So that's why there can be a lot of easy exploitation and whatnot. The general objective for the act is to guarantee employees, right, the people who are working, quote, the right to self-organization, to form, join, or assist labor organizations, to bargain collectively through representatives of their own choosing, and to engage in concerted activities for the purpose of collective bargaining or other mutual aid and protection. So basically protecting people's rights to organize, to advocate for themselves and all of that. And that's what the NLRB does, the National Labor Relations Board, is it investigates that, it upholds those practices, it does, it's the action part of this act, making sure that all of that is protected. So the legacy of the New Deal as a whole. It does some really important things. It still has long-lasting effects in many ways, right? It puts into place agencies that we have, Social Security, welfare, unemployment, securing bank deposits, labor reform, so minimum wage, 40-hour work week, all of that. We also see a massive demographic shift with the shift in political parties, with African Americans voting Democratic now. We see capitalism reform, so a lot of those things are really important. But it also does put into place some of the problems that we still have today, right? Institutionalized sexism, racism, classism in terms of certain, systems and whatnot that we rely on today. It also sets into place welfare and Social Security practices and some of the pitfalls that those have. So it definitely did some really good things, and it was this massive experiment that we tried, but it also wasn't perfect. And there is still a big debate over this and whether or not this was effective or not. Unfortunately, though, the New Deal gets heavily criticized from both sides, right? People on the left say it didn't do enough, right? We should have gone more socialist. We should have pushed further. We need to go even further in that direction and increase the amount of government programs and institutions and whatnot. Whereas the other side would say, no, this was way too much, right? It went too far. We should have a free market economy. We should have a smaller government. This overstepped all the bounds. So it did some really important things, but it also had some problems, and it was also heavily criticized by most people. Okay. And finally, Couple other things to keep in mind, some of what we've talked about, right? So we do see this very important shift in African American voting, and this is due to multiple things. So one is the fact that we're really starting to see more and more African Americans vote for the first time. As people move north, they're able to vote, whereas they weren't allowed to vote in the South. And two, they begin voting Democratic, right? Because they're voting for Roosevelt and they're voting for the New Deal. So this helps us sort of see this transition. And part of why they're voting for the New Deal is because Hoover was doing nothing for them. The African American community was at 50% unemployment because they were always the first fired, right? Because, we're racist and stuff. So there's that. Now, the other important thing to keep in mind is what's going on in Europe. And that's what we're going to talk about next. But as we're dealing with the Great Depression, it's hitting Europe as well, and that's going to have some major ramifications, obviously, for the world as we head into World War II. So as we learn about the Great Depression here in the States, the ramp up to World War II is happening simultaneously. Right, in 1933, Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany, same year that Roosevelt's elected. In 1935, Italy invades present-day Ethiopia, and Mussolini starts trying to reclaim Italian glory and ramp up the nationalism. In the 1930s as well, Japan is going to start invading China. So we're seeing all of the steps taken towards World War II happening at the same time as we see the Great Depression going on in the U.S. And so one of our responses to that is we passed the Neutrality Act in 1935. And the goal of the Neutrality Act is to avoid international entanglements, right? It gives the president the power to determine if a state of war exists anywhere in the world, and if so, to declare an embargo, limit tourism, and refuse loans to those countries who are at war. So we're preemptively preparing ourselves to remain neutral if and when war does break out. We're keeping an eye on what's happening in Europe, and we want the option to remain neutral and not jump into the war, right? We don't necessarily want to go there. So finally, to wrap all of this up, right, the New Deal helps so much with the Great Depression. It really does help. It helps give basic relief to people. It helps people keep people fed and in their homes and all of that, but it does not end the Great Depression. World War II will end the Great Depression. So it's not the New Deal helped, but really World War II is what will bring the Great Depression to the end, and the production boom that comes with that, and then, of course, the Cold War that will follow that, all of which we'll learn about, is really what brings this terrible time period to an end. All right.